So again, the objective wasn't to get an absolute correct answer, but to get you thinking about the evidence you might use, the relative importance of different services. So I'll be interested to know, in terms of the provisioning services, based on this very limited evidence of 4 photographs, were there any provisioning services you thought were of high importance? Anyone would like to throw out a provisioning service they thought would be high importance? So did people have maybe, of the food ones, any of those they thought were high? Fish? Yeah. And fish is very, very important here. Very important fisheries here. There are 14 villages around this area which depend on fish from this site. So about 60,000 people depend on their main source of protein from this site. So you don't need to quantify that in terms of money. You can say there's 60,000 people living around this site and 15, 16 villages that depend on this for fish. That's a quantification without even putting a monetary value on that. You could put a market price on that. Any other provisioning services that you thought were either low or you didn't have enough information on? Rice? Oh, medicinal. So, fuel wood. So things like medicinal and fuel wood, you really need to know the social context of the site. Are there people that collect plants, they use them? And quite often that will vary even from village to village, and from wetland to wetland, even in the same country. Because there's a lot of local tradition about collecting plants and using them for medicinal purposes. Likewise with fuel wood, this site, there's not a lot of trees there, so there's very little in terms of wood harvesting, but there are some trees and there's a bit of fuel wood harvesting. And what's interesting, there's a invasive species, mimosa here, and the local wardens are getting the local people to harvest the mimosa to basically deal with an invasive species issue to collect fuel wood rather than using native species. In terms of rice, again, there isn't evidence here, but rice is becoming increasingly important within the site, and there is a move to try and increase the amount of rice farming, which has problems because you convert maybe lotus area or open water into rice. But actually, one of the most important functions of this site is the irrigation water that it stores, which supplies rice downstream. So when you're thinking about the scale of the benefit, it isn't just people living in and around the wetland. There's a whole community of thousands and thousands of people along several kilometres downstream that their agriculture, which is primarily rice agriculture, depends on this site. So actually making that link between the spatial context of the who benefits. It's not just the people in the wetland, it's people several kilometres downstream benefit from the water from this wetland. But you'd pick that up not under food of rice, but under fresh water for irrigation as a service. Were there any provisioning services that you just thought, no, we can't do that? I mean, those ones are the main ones that you thought you needed more information on.
Clay minerals.
The clay minerals, yeah, harvesting. So there is a little bit of harvesting done. And fibre, there's fibre is done. I mean, you can see the guys collecting the roots. But interestingly, I went here and I did an assessment on my own of the services, and then I spoke to the site managers because I just thought it would be interesting to see what my perception was coming from Europe to their perception. And what I missed is that there is clay harvested from here, and they make little figures, little human figures, as a local cultural thing. Now, I would never have known that coming from my social context to this social context. Only talking to the local people did I understand that they collect some of the clay and they use it for making little figures. So, and that has a real sort of spiritual as well as a local cultural value, which I would never have known. And again, that's why it's really important to talk to local people, to talk to the local managers, site wardens, in the local community to understand how they interact with the wetland. Because I could come with many, many years' experience and I could miss a whole load of these ecosystem services. So it's really important to engage. In terms of the regulating services, any ones that people thought were really important? Given that the site is worth $91.6 million for carbon, maybe climate regulation might be important. Even though today it might not be 91.6, it might be 91.7. Yeah. And then regulating flows of water in terms of downstream for the irrigated agriculture. But again, from the photos, it's quite difficult to pick up on some of the regulating ones. But in terms of things like having a mix of open water and vegetated and floating vegetation, there's very good evidence that the evaporation, the loss of energy from a wetland into the atmosphere through transpiration from plants, evaporation from water, the energy that drives that process takes energy out of the environment. So it reduces the air temperature. So in terms of regulating the temperature around this area, and it's interesting, I've been there, and when you're walking along the edge of the wetland, even on a hot summer's day, it's cooler than if you walk 200 metres into a rice paddy, especially when the rice has been harvested and the paddies are dry. The temperature just goes up. You feel it. You can notice it in the space of a few hundred metres. So regulating just daily temperatures is important. In terms of what about pest regulation? Do we think that might be important here? Anyone put that as a low or a medium or a high? High. And again, when you have a well-functioning wetland, where you have the ecology is pretty much in balance, which for the most part this site it is, you don't get a lot of pest species, you don't get a lot of rats, or you don't get a lot of mosquitoes, because there are the animals that predate them. So you'll get dragonfly larvae, which will eat a huge number of mosquito larvae. You'll get other animals, birds that will take the mosquitoes when they're flying, bats that will take mosquitoes when they're flying. So you'll get a whole load of other control species, natural control species, which will control those pest species. Here, rats are mainly killed by snakes, because there's a good snake population. So again, if you've got a wetland that's in a good ecological state, quite often the pest species aren't a big problem. And likewise, then human disease becomes much less of a problem. Were there any regulating services you thought we just don't have any information on, that you couldn't understand? Or did most of them, you think, from your experience, you could make some sort of estimate? Pest regulation. Noise, yeah. In terms of noise regulation, some wetlands are very good at buffering noise. They might have large trees and shrubs which will... They absorb noise. That's right. So, for instance, in Colombo in Sri Lanka, where there's a lot of urban wetlands, you can have a 4-lane highway going through the city with all the cars, and you can go into the wetland and almost not hear the highway because it is regulating the noise. Equally, some wetlands, so for instance, open water, noise travels faster over open water. And so if you have a different type of wetland, it can actually become a negative. It can actually make the noise sound louder. And interesting, again, in Sri Lanka, they've converted some of the old forested wetlands and sort of swamps into open water tanks. And now you walk around them and all you hear is traffic. Whereas before you would never have heard the traffic. And also you get the pollution because the air quality regulation has gone as well. So sometimes noise and air quality go hand in hand. Okay, in terms of the cultural services, again, a lot of these are local, context specific. I mean, there's some indications there. There's a shrine on the site. What did people think? Were there any cultural services they thought were really important? Education, yes. So there's an education centre there. They get many school groups, local community groups. Tourism. Tourism is very important here, and recreation. Yeah, aesthetically, it's a very attractive site, which is why people come there. But again, this is where understanding the service is really important and putting it in context.
And inspirational value also. beautiful, scenic beauty inspires the artist.
That's right. So there's a lot of inspirational value. Yep. But in terms of the tourism, and this is an interesting one, because in many countries, and I work in several countries and I'm working at the moment on several sites, where governments are saying we need to increase money, we want more money. So we will increase, and they use the term ecotourism, even though they have no idea what eco means. They just put it on, sounds good. We'll have ecotourism and everything will be fine. And what they mean is we want more tourists going to natural sites. Now here, in 2011, there were around about 6,000 people visited this site, of which about 200 were from overseas, and the remainder were local people that visit the site. That was in 2011. In 2016, we'd gone from about 5,000 or 6,000 to over 60,000 people. That trajectory is going up. The person that the government allowed to run the tourism facilities here is now trying to build something like a 50, maybe a 60-bedroom hotel in the Ramsar site. Because he's saying, well, look, there's so many people, we need more facilities. And so you have a service that it starts off being part of the ecological character of the site, part of the importance of the site. Yet when that starts going up, when does it stop being a service and become a threat? Because what is happening, as those visitor numbers increase, you're thinking, great, this ecosystem service is getting better and better. But the money that comes to the site is exactly the same whether you get one tourist or 100,000 tourists. The person gets paid the same, or pays the government the same for his franchise for looking after this place, yet he is now wanting to put more and more tourists, more facilities in there, so he makes more money. The site managers don't get any of that money. The government don't get any of that money. But the burden, the amount of extra work it is causing the site staff in terms of cleaning up litter, dealing with wastewater problems, disturbance of wildlife, damage to wildlife, a whole load of things that happen as you try to maximise one service. Exactly what I was saying before with the example of the engineer and the farmer and the wetland manager. If you maximise, we really try and get as much tourism income as possible. Actually, what you're doing is a lot of the other services you will lose. And so I've started with the site manager to explain that and demonstrate that, because the site managers have been out doing assessments of wetland ecosystem services, the assessments that you'll be doing in the field tomorrow. And what I've said is, if we do a scenario where the tourism increases, as it is going at the moment exponentially, if it carries on increasing at this rate, where maybe this year we could get 100,000 visitors, then we can see the impact that we will lose the value of some of the other services. And then the government has a choice. Does this, in terms of a Ramsar site, does that change the ecological character to a negative? So when governments say, oh, we want ecotourism, well, maybe sometimes it can be good, but at some point it might not be good. And this is where doing a qualitative assessment is useful, but having the quantitative assessment is also really valuable, using the two together. Okay, what about the supporting services? What did people think about those? Were there any supporting services they didn't think were happening here?
Primary production.
Primary production.
Yeah.
So the conversion of energy. So I would say there's a huge amount of primary production here. There's a lot of vegetation, there's algae, there's a lot of primary production. It's a highly productive system. But it's one of those ones that people struggle with, trying to understand.
Provision of habitat for the fish, birds.
Yeah. Well, here we have a great diversity of habitat. There's open water, there's different types of habitat. Yeah. But usually if you've got a well-functioning wetland, most of those supporting services will be pretty high and pretty important, because if you think back to the iceberg, they underpin all the other services. Okay, so I need to change presentation. Okay, so what I want to do now in the next about 4 hours is just quickly run through what we're going to be doing tomorrow in terms of the technique that we've been developing. So one of the challenges is if we all understand that wetlands have multiple values, and how do we recognise those, and how do we do something that is rapid? Now, there's many assessment techniques which claim to be rapid. Interestingly, in America, in the USA, there was an exercise done to actually try and develop a wetland monitoring technique which was rapid. And the researchers in the United States came up with some criteria. And these are the ones that they said which, if something is going to be a rapid assessment, and I think this also equally applies to RMET to an extent, it's got to be a short time frame. You've got to be able to do something in less than a couple of hours. It's got to provide an overview of many different things. You've got to be able to use your local knowledge and your own expert knowledge. Because it's rapid, it's never going to give you an absolute figure or answer. It's always going to be subjective, but you have to accept that.
I think rapid will not give any quantitative data.
No.
Only qualitative.
Well, it says it will give relative assessments, a qualitative assessment, but it can't always give you a quantitative. But it also requires low cost and resources. Now, there's lots of studies that claim to be rapid. That one on Mwinji that I showed you, which had the carbon figure of 91.6 million, that said it was a rapid technique. It took 4 months, and it cost $60,000. To me, that's not rapid. That's not even getting close to being rapid. So a detailed study can take many weeks or months. Sometimes it's because of resources, it only focuses on a small subset of issues. Sometimes it involves huge input from many stakeholders. And whilst it reduces subjectivity, it doesn't remove subjectivity. Subjectivity still remains. And it tries to provide an absolute assessment, but because it remains subjective, it doesn't always achieve that. And usually it requires high cost and resources. So our challenge was, can we do something which is rapid, which is genuinely rapid? What it isn't, and the approach that we've developed, it's not going to give you an absolute monetary value. It will not be able to say your wetland is worth X number of dollars or whatever currency you're working in. And it isn't going to give you a single value. It's not going to say this wetland has that value. But also, it's not going to require a lot of field work or a lot of data collection or a lot of stakeholder engagement. It's something that recognises the limitations imposed on all of us as wetland managers. But equally, it's not going to just look at a small subset. It's going to try and look at the full range of values and not just a few values. Because you can go two ways. You can make it rapid by only looking at a few things, and you look at those in maybe more detail, or you look at more things but in less detail. So it's going to look at more things, but by looking at more services, more benefits, it's going to look at those in less detail. So basically the objectives when myself and my colleagues were putting this together was we've got to have something which is easy for wetland managers to use. If it's not easy, people won't use it. Simple as that. And we've got to look at how can we look at the multiple benefits. And it recognises that wetland managers have very little time, very little resources. I don't think anyone sitting in this room would say, oh, I've got a member of staff that's sitting around doing nothing. He can do the wetland evaluation, or she can. So we really understand that a lot of the techniques, and I worked in universities for many years, where we were developing a technique for assessing the functions and values of wetlands. When it was finally published, it was a book that was almost 2,000 pages long and would take a really highly qualified wetland scientist something like a month to work their way through the book. Surprisingly, that book never sold. No one's ever used it because it was developed by academics thinking this is what wetland managers need. And when we were running that project, I kept on trying to talk to wetland managers, but the person that was responsible for the project said, no, we will tell the wetland managers what they need, and they will use it. Whereas we developed this by talking to wetland managers and saying, what do you need? How little time do you have? how little resource do you have. So it recognises the realities of managing wetlands. And it looks at relative values, but also it tries to look at the scale at which wetland benefits accrue. Are they delivered locally? Are those benefits more widespread, maybe regionally or nationally, or are they global benefits? Because to me, probably the crucial thing is within a robust framework and a structured framework, the approach we've developed links the benefit to who benefits. Is it a local beneficiary? Is it people living in and around the wetland? Or is it people downstream? So like in Mwinji, there are benefits for people within and living around the wetland, but also downstream. And then also some of those carbon benefits could be global benefits. So it makes that link between the benefit and who benefits, and it gives a framework to do that in. And this work was primarily developed by my colleague, Dr. Mark Everard, who's the one with the silly hat on over there, and myself with the silly hat on in that picture. And Mark's a professor in the university in the UK. And we've field trialled this in many, many countries, and this isn't just something we've just come up with. We've been working on this for many years. And Mark and myself have been working on this for over 25 years, looking specifically at wetland values and the full range of values. We do a lot of work with wetland managers all over the world. Mark does a lot of work in India. He's worked extensively in East Africa. I do a lot of work all over the world. And we understand the realities of the challenges faced by wetland managers, but also the need to come up with some sort of systematic framework that allows the local knowledge of wetland managers and local communities to be captured and delivered within a framework. And the work's been peer-reviewed. We did a lot of work in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, and this has been published. And so that it was important to us to publish it in a scientific journal because that gives it some credibility. It means it's been peer-reviewed by the scientific experts. It's not just us saying it's a good idea. On the back of this has also been, the whole approach has been reviewed by the Ramsar SDRP, which is why it's now going towards a draft resolution for adoption. So, what do we have to do? Well, there's 3 stages. We have to prepare. You have to know what you're going to go and assess, which wetland, which part of a wetland. What do you need to do? What do you need to take with you? What equipment do you need? Who's going to be doing it? And then you go into the field. And what sort of things do you do when you're in the field? Well, you're using your own observations. You might be talking with local people that you might see. You're having discussions. And what we've recommended, and we've done field trials on this, is if when you do an assessment, and tomorrow we will split up into small groups, but ideally we found that 2 people working together with slightly different backgrounds works really well. So if you've got someone who's maybe the site manager, or maybe someone from an NGO or from a university, or maybe a government official with a local person, where you've got 2 slightly different perceptions. If you have 3 people, you end up with a consensus. You say, well, 2 of us have said this, only one says that, 2 are right, you're wrong. When you have 2 people, you have to have a discussion and come to an agreement. You don't just say, well, 2 beats 1. So we find working with 2 people works really well. And you record the information in a systematic way. And what we've also found, if you're on site and you see local people, just go up to them and have a chat with them if there's things you're not sure about. It doesn't take a lot of more time, but if you're familiar with the site, you might not need to do that. And then once you've done your assessment, you've got to manage the information. So you've got to make sure you've checked the information before you leave the field, and then you can enter the data, and there's ways you can manipulate that. And we'll look at some of those when we come back in on Friday after we've been in the field tomorrow. So in terms of the preparation, 2 people should work together ideally. Tomorrow we'll start working in slightly larger groups, but we might, as the day progresses, we might split into pairs depending on how we get on tomorrow. And they should be knowledgeable about the wetland. And even when you've got someone like myself who's been working in wetlands for 25 years, if I walked into a wetland in one of your countries, I will miss things. You will know more about that wetland than I do. So having people that have local knowledge is really important. And you should define an area. What is the wetland, which bit of the wetland, or is it the whole wetland I'm assessing? Now, if you have an Indonesian peatland of 50,000 hectares, Would you do one assessment of the whole site, or would you maybe divide it up? If you're in Singapore and you have a wetland about the size of this stage, you might say one assessment would work for that. So what area am I going to assess? And tomorrow we'll look at dividing it up into different habitat types, because it might make more sense to say, okay, here I have an area of forested wetland, here I have a tidal mudflat, here I have an open water lake. You might want to divide it up by habitat. And then also the obvious things of health and safety. It might be you're limited in terms of where you can get into the wetland, so there's pragmatic constraints. And we have assessment sheets that we will take with us tomorrow, and we'll look at those in a minute. Make sure you have plenty, because you will always drop them, or it will be raining, or something will happen to them. Take pens and pencils and suitable field equipment. So for instance, tomorrow, some people might want to take sunblock, you might need insect repellents, the usual things you would take for personal protection in the field. Then when you're in the field, you have in the handouts a series of sort of sheets which go through different services and has a series of questions that you might want to think about to ask yourself or each other. So, and you're using field indicators. You're looking around and saying, okay, well, I know in my country or in my wetland, if I see that sort of community of plants, they're probably harvesting whatever from it, or they might be collecting these, or in this situation, this wetland, I can see it's a tidal wetland, it might be stopping storms. You're using field indicators. You're using things you know in your head, you're seeing. And you're then putting that in a wider context. And one of the things I always encourage people to do when they're doing an assessment is don't do this. Get your head up and look around. Look at the context of your wetland in the landscape. And don't just think about the physical landscape in terms of the hills and the rivers and the sea. Think about the social landscape. Are there communities around it? Because you might have a wetland that's really good and growing loads and loads and loads of plants which could be used for medicinal purposes, but if the nearest community is 30 kilometres away, no one's going to be coming 30 kilometres to harvest those plants. So think about the context, and can you link the service to the beneficiary? And use local knowledge. So when we go out tomorrow, you might want to ask some of the local people who are based here, or myself, I've visited this site many times, about local contexts. And sometimes if you see a local person, you might want to ask them. And they might give you a bit of information that you would never have understood. And there's many situations I've been in when you talk to local people, you find out things that you just didn't know. And make sure you have good conversations about things. Don't just jump to conclusions. Always try and talk it through between two of you. Engage with local people. And the other thing I would say is on the assessment sheets, try and record as much information as possible when you're doing the assessment. So if you put something down and you score it a certain way, and we'll look at the scoring in a minute, why did you do that? What evidence? So make some notes. Because when you come back, and if you've done several sites or different parts of a site, and you're sitting there a week later, you're looking at your sheet thinking, why have I put that down? Try and capture as much information, because it will help you later on when you go back to maybe look at the information. And I'd always say before you leave the field, make sure you filled in all the information you have to fill in, because once you've left the field and you go back to it, sometimes it's difficult to remember what you saw, especially if you've done different sites or different areas within a wetland in one day. And then you can enter the data onto an Excel spreadsheet. And again, this will be provided to you. And again, if you have two people that have done the assessment, sometimes it's much better to come back to your office and have two people that have done the assessment, one reading it out, one typing it in. You're less likely to get mistakes that way. And one of the things it's useful sometimes if you're doing many sites to know the location, and you might want to check the latitude and longitude. You can, if you have a handheld GPS, you can do it in the field, but Google Earth, you can get it straight off Google Earth, pull it up on the screen, you can find out exactly where you were. And I always say make the location in terms of where you did the assessment as the actual place you were standing, not the wetland you were looking at. Because if someone wants to repeat that assessment, if they stand in the same location, they will be looking at the same wetland as you. And if there are any other issues that you picked up when you were on site which might be useful in terms of any management actions, so if you've seen something like invasive species or illegal dumping of solid waste, or if you saw a rare or threatened species that you weren't aware of, anything else. It's always useful when you're out there just to capture other bits of information. So one of the first things you've got to do is think about, what am I going to assess? What area am I going to look at? And when you look at a wetland, this is a coastal wetland, you might look at that and say, well, I'm going to assess the whole wetland, because it's all a coastal wetland. But sometimes if you've got a very complex site, what you might want to do is say, well, there's a main channel which is permanently flooded. Maybe I think of that as a separate type of wetland. And then I have these other areas of mudflat. And they're different communities. They have maybe some short grasses or areas of open mud. What I might say is, actually, I've got two different areas I'm going to assess. I'm going to do the channels, which are permanently flooded. They're a tidal channel, a tidal creek. And then the salt marsh community and the mudflat community. You might want to then subdivide it even further. It depends on how much time you've got or why you're doing it. So think about the area that you're going to be assessing. Is it going to be based on a habitat type? Or it might be you've got management compartments. And I know in Myanmar at Maimulachun, I was discussing with the site manager that they have different areas which are patrolled within the site. Maybe do assessment for each of the patrol areas. So think about the area and the context that you're doing it in. And this is what the assessment sheets look like, and you'll be filling these in tomorrow. So the first thing you have to do is just some general information, which is the standard thing that you'll get in probably any assessment like RMET: the name of the site, the location, who's there, who's doing the work, the date, etc. Fairly straightforward, universal information. I'm not sure whether these are being given out. Oh yes, you should have one at the back. So that's standard information. And then what we have is a checklist of ecosystem services. Now what I always say is, before you go in the field, you should think about this list and put it into a local context. Use your own information before you go out. This list is not meant to be the final list. You've always got to, this is used as a guide to help you think about the sort of services. So where it says fresh water, what does fresh water mean? Fresh water, what? Maybe for irrigated agriculture. Fresh water from hand-dug wells for drinking. Fresh water for livestock to drink. Fresh water could be many different things. Food could be rice. It could be fruit. It could be fish. It could be shellfish. It could be roots of vegetables. So again, the more you can elaborate on this, fuel wood, it might be fuel wood from different types of tree, or it might be fibre from different types of plant. So try and expand it. Use this as a starting point, rather than actually saying, well, I'm just going to look at food and that's it. Because again, the more detail you can add in, the better. And so there's a whole range of services, and really within the local context, what we say to people is modify it to your local setting, your local wetland, rather than saying I've got to use this approach and use these words. And then we ask people to make an assessment of how important is the service. And we use this very simple scale. It's essentially a 5-point scale. And we say that if there's no service, if you can't link the service to who benefits, if no one's benefiting from it, then there is no service. So the example earlier on, you might have a whole load of plants that could be harvested as medicines, natural medicines. But if no one's harvesting them, no one's getting that benefit. It could be you have a wetland which stores a whole load of floodwater during flooding, but there are no communities downstream that are protected because no one lives downstream of the wetland. So you need to link the service to who benefits. If you can't make that linkage, and if you think that ecosystem services are the benefits society get from nature, if there is no one benefiting, then it's not a service, so it would be a 0. However, if there's a positive benefit, and if there are sort of a limited number of beneficiaries, and you might want to put your own limits on this. So for instance, in the Ramsar Information Sheet, it asks you to look at sort of whether it's tens or hundreds or thousands of people benefiting. You might say, actually, well, a positive benefit would be maybe up to 1,000 people. If it's more than 1,000 people, maybe that's two pluses. It's a significant positive benefit. Or it might be the actual nature of the service is really, really important for that specific wetland. So if you have a culturally very important wetland, then maybe that gets a high score. Or if it's a wetland that's important for protected species, it might be a Ramsar site because it's designated for some rare and endemic species. But again, as long as you're consistent in how you apply this, there's no absolute cut-off point, as there never is between a high or a medium or high and a low. So it's just whether it's a positive benefit or a significant positive, so a single plus or a double plus. But equally, there might be some services which are a disbenefit. And interestingly, when I was running a similar training course here a couple of years ago, some colleagues from China said that they had a wetland which was attracting a lot of migratory birds, which was good in terms of provision of habitat. But in terms of disease regulation, those birds would bring in avian influenza into contact with the local community. And so they said from disease regulation, that was seen as a disbenefit. So sometimes a service can be a disbenefit. Or it might be if you've got a wetland that floods frequently and there are communities that live in that wetland, that they are, I mean, I've worked in South Africa, in Johannesburg and in Soweto, the very famous township where Nelson Mandela came from. The poorest people live right on the edge of the wetlands of the Klip River. And every year they get flooded out. Because that's the cheapest, poorest piece of land you can find in South Africa or in Soweto to live on. And that is a disbenefit to them. So having flooding in terms of hazard regulation for that community is a disbenefit. For other communities downstream, it might be a positive. So you need to think about, do some people maybe don't benefit from the wetland? And is that only a few people or is it a lot of people in terms of a single negative or a double negative? There's a sixth one, which is, well, you actually don't know. You need a little bit more information. You need to maybe go and talk to someone or do a little bit of research on the internet or maybe talk to some local communities. So sometimes you'll just put a question mark because there's a gap in the evidence. So it's basically it's a 5 or a 6 point if you include the question mark scale. And again, this will make more sense tomorrow when we start filling it in. And so once you've put the score in, you have to describe the benefit. And so you try and capture in words what that benefit is. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. And then we look at the scale. So are the beneficiaries local, regional, or global? But equally, you could change this because you might want to make it a different spatial context. You might want to have in the site, outside the site, within the local area. But we use those three. But again, you can subdivide that. The main thing here is trying to link the benefit on one side in terms of the service with the scale that that benefit is achieved. Is that local people? Is that people within the region? It might be within the catchment or the watershed. It might be within the coastal zone. Or it might be within the country. But you can change those. This isn't a prescriptive method that says you must do this. It's more of an approach rather than a tool. And that would just be you just tick those boxes. So what you might say for this is local communities living and working in and around the wetland, or people immediately upstream or downstream. Regional, it might be people much further away, people that travel there, people that commute to a wetland, or the global benefits might be beyond the country's boundary and a long way away. And so, again, we've got some examples of different local people. It might be local fishermen, local farmers, villages, local festivals or local education opportunities. So this is very much looking at different types of beneficiaries around and in a wetland. Regional, it might be fishing communities that rely on a wetland as a nursery ground, or communities downstream that are protected from flooding or provided with water. Or it might be farmers that live some distance away, but there's many pollinators that fly out of a wetland and go and pollinate their crops. Or it might be religious followers that come from the local communities, maybe several miles away or kilometres away, or even university students that come and study. And global, it might be resources that are sold internationally, harvested. Might be carbon storage, which affects global climate change. International pilgrims that might come for a cultural reason. Or global conservation community if there might be internationally threatened or protected species. So a whole range of scales of benefit and who benefits. So you fill it in, you put the name of the site, grid reference, date, and the names of the people doing the assessment. And it might be that freshwater for this for Happy Valley tidal mudflat. So Lennon and McCartney might have said, well, it's a tidal system. No one's getting any fresh water because it's tidal, it's salt water. So there's no fresh water being delivered. Predominantly brackish, no fresh water. So the scale's not applicable. Food, you might say, well, there's extensive shellfish. You might know that. You might see indicators in the environment that tell you that they're growing shellfish. Sometimes you see these sort of beds of shellfish. And it's a regional value. You know that actually those shellfish are sold in a regional market in a town downstream. There could be local collection of fuel of driftwood that comes up on the shore of the valley of this Happy Valley tidal mudflat, Happy Bay tidal mudflat, and people collect that wood and they use it for fuel wood because there's very little trees they can collect. And that's a local benefit, but there's only a small number of people doing that. And so you carry on filling it in like this. And again, we'll go through this in more detail tomorrow in the field. So I was going to do this, but because time's moving on, I'll just quickly run this through because this is the sort of area we're going to go to tomorrow. This is the bay just to the south of here. We're just literally to the north of this. And you can see that what you have is areas of open water channel, extensive areas of mudflat, and then a fringing reed marsh, and then we have agricultural fields, which are predominantly fresh water. And so if you were to look at this, you might want to decide, am I going to assess all that as one area? Or you might say, well, actually, I'll look at different units within it. And what we'll do tomorrow, and depending on time tomorrow, we will look at different parts of this system. So we will go out on a boat, and we will look at the mud flats from the channel. And these are very extensive mud flats, very important for shorebirds and wading birds. We'll look at some of the agricultural fields, because these are still wetland, but they're freshwater rice paddy. We'll look at some of the reed swamp, which is a natural reed swamp. And then we might look at some other, so for instance, you can see in the middle, there's an area of created wetland. Aha, you have a pointer.
This one, middle.
Oh, the middle one. Aha. So we have an area here of created man-made wetland. And we'll also maybe look at man-made wetland, human-made wetlands. And so if you were to assess this, you might divide up, you might have an area of mudflat that you'd look at, an area of reed swamp, an area of freshwater rice paddy, maybe an area of human-made wetland. You might want to subdivide the site up like that. I was going to do an exercise where you would do this, but we're running out of time. So we're not going to do that. So we're only 55 minutes behind. What we'll do tomorrow, and I'm sure you'll have loads of questions, and in the interest of time and everyone getting out of here and staying awake, tomorrow morning before we start in the field, we will meet in a classroom down on the site, and we'll go through this in a bit more detail. We'll explain the sites we're going to. Everyone will have a handout. We'll split into probably 4 groups, and we will then work in our groups looking at different parts. Different parts, not necessarily this part, but similar parts of Sunshine Bay. But we will explain in a bit more detail tomorrow. But before we close off, were there any immediate questions that people had? Yep.
I'm very sorry over there.
No.
my question is that through rapid assessment, so I am doubtful to come to the conclusion that if the area is small, with monotonous, it's okay. Rapid assessment with less cost, human resources, financial resources, we do it. But if it's in a big area with different landscapes, different biodiversity, and if suppose I'm supposed to do estimate of this Sunchen Bay, and if there's no stakeholders involved, and I'm new to this bay, and rapid estimates with the time constraints, human resources. So if it is monotonous landscape, then at least I can my conclusion will be generalized.
Yes.
But if this whole bay is of different landscapes and different biodiversity with limited time, so am I not being fair? Am I being fair to conclude that what I have done assessment is few places? So how can generalize to all this huge area?
And that is a real challenge. I mean, in terms of the knowledge, we always say you've got to use people that have local knowledge of the site. I've been working in wetlands for 25 years. I know a lot about wetlands. I will go to any of the wetlands that you're responsible for, and you will know far more about that wetland than I will ever know. And I'm supposed to be a wetland expert. I'm not a wetland expert in your wetland. You are the expert in your wetland. So you've got to use local knowledge. So it's got to have at least one of those people, the two assessors, has got to have the knowledge of the wetland. Otherwise, you'll just make a general assessment. In terms of the complexity of a site, that is always a challenge. And when you have a very, very large site, you have to make a decision, and that is always a balance between why you're doing the assessment and what is it you want from the assessment, and what resources do you have. So, for instance, if you're updating a Ramsar information sheet, you might say, well, actually, I've got some information already. I just want to make sure that I've caught the main services. So you might say, well, actually, rather than go out to the site, I will sit with my staff in an office with a map of the site and say, okay, well, let's have a quick, just discuss it, and we'll do an assessment on that area based on a map and the knowledge your staff have. And then we say, well, we divide the site into 3 or 4 main habitat types, and we just do one for each habitat type. Or it might be you're interested in a particular issue. Maybe you're going to have a management change, or you have a zonation of sites. You want to look at different zones. So it really depends on your purpose of the assessment. What we have found, and you'll find this in the next couple of days, is if you've got good knowledge and good people, you can probably do an assessment in less than an hour. And I'll give an example on Friday, which we did in Sri Lanka, where we got the assessment of each individual site down to about an hour, and then a bit of time when you get back to data entry and analysis. But yeah, it's a real challenge. Big complex sites are always going to be a challenge, but they're exactly the same challenge in terms of monitoring biodiversity, doing RMEP, whatever it is. So that it is a challenge. Sometimes, and I've done this before with very complex sites, is rather than going out to every different place, is just sit down with the site managers, get all the wardens around a table, and just say, right, we're going to do it one for the whole site, and just break down your list. And if there are certain services you can say on a map, that service is really important in this area, you just link your assessment to a map. But it is a challenge. There's no easy answer, but it depends on the purpose of your assessment. Okay, that's us done for today. Norman, any housekeeping?
Yep, and before we actually close this session, may I request everyone to give Robert a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Then we'll see you again tomorrow.